From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk radio network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Uncovering super bosses and the mastering of talent management. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Syd Finkelstein is the Stephen Roth Professor of Management at a place close to my heart, the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, where he's also the director of the Tuck Center for Leadership. He's listed in the Thinkers 50, the most prestigious global ranking of leadership gurus. He's been on our show for his impactful book and Wall Street Journal bestseller, Why Smart Leaders Fail. Syd's going the other way in this book, Super Bosses, How Exceptional Leaders Master the Flow of Talent. Good morning, Syd. Thanks for joining us again.
Great to talk to you, Jim.
Legend up at Tuck, and I've got my Dartmouth golf shirt on in your honor. I'll be wearing my Tuck golf shirt tomorrow when I'm actually playing. All right, I want to start right off because it seems kind of like an oxymoron to me that an exceptional super boss by definition would seem to be unique. Are you saying that we can kind of clone and gain lessons and define what is a Finkelstein super boss?
Super boss is a leader, is a boss, is a manager who helps other people accomplish more than they ever thought possible. And as a result, they accelerate the careers of those people. And you could see it because you see the track record of a leader over a period of time where many of his or her protégés have moved on to great things. And the reality is, yes, you could have super bosses. In fact, we do have super bosses up and down pretty much every organization.
Tell us briefly your methodology, because you spent 10 years on this.
Yeah, I did, and it was really a long, rigorous process, hundreds of interviews. And what I did up front is I realized, and you mentioned the earlier book, Why Smart Executives Fail. At the end of the day, I kept getting the same question coming up, and that is, what about the talent side of the equation? I mean, are they surrounding themselves with great people, and what really differentiates this? I came to realize that the ability to generate and regenerate talent on a continuous basis, probably the single best thing you could do in any organization to survive and thrive into the long term. And that set me off on a path to look for people like this, who's really good at it. And I looked at people like Alice Waters at Shep Penny's restaurant in Berkeley, Miles Davis, a really unusual example. I just saw the Miles Ahead movie the other day. I looked at people like Ralph Lauren and a lot of others, and every step of the way, what I did is I interviewed either the super boss and actually always a bunch of the protégés of the super boss to try to understand what do they do that's so special and what's the pattern that exists here. So that was the methodology, and it was very iterative. I didn't walk in saying, well, this is what it is. I didn't even have the word super boss in my head for a long time. It just kind of emerged when I talked to these hundreds of people trying to figure out what really separates the people that are good at generating and regenerating talent.
And I love the three sort of creative names you came up for the categories where you kind of segmented them in, including my favorite, the Glorious Bastards. Tell us a little bit about the categories.
This is all about the style and the motivation of these leaders to account for why they help other people get better. And they're different. You mentioned the Glorious Bastards. They're people like Larry Ellison, really tough CEOs or executives or managers. And many people say, how could he or any of these people be great bosses? But in fact, if you work for somebody like that, the opportunities are gigantic. I spoke to so many of his protégés that have gone on, Larry Ellison's protégés, that have gone on to tremendous success. And the key thing here is that these people, they want to win, and that's what they care about. That's how they define their life. What they have, the insight they have, is that the best pathway to winning is surrounding yourself with world-class talent and continually making them and helping them get better. And so while they might not be the nurturing type, which is another one of the three categories, they're not going to nurture you all that much. The fact of the matter is that they do help you get a lot better because they recognize how important you are to their own success. So you've got the Glorious Bastards. The nurturers are the ones that maybe people think of a little bit more often when you say, well, what's a great boss? This is somebody who spends the time with you, helps you get better, looks for what you need to get better. And the third type were little bit more unusual in the sense that they were the creative types. Miles Davis fits into this category for sure. These are people that I call them iconoclasts, and these are leaders really that end up surrounding themselves with tremendous talent because these people they gravitate towards the creative types, and they get better just by being in that circle with that leader. And so the motivation is different for all three of these types, but the fascinating thing is they all pretty much do the same thing. Where
would Donald Trump fit in?
I mentioned him briefly in the book, and Trump, boy, he's not any one of the three in my view. Some people will say he's the glorious bastard, but in fact, the truth is, well, he might be part of that. The truth is that he there's no track record of his ability helping other people get better and spawning a set of great leaders that have developed and moved on in the industry. I actually call him in the book the bossy boss.
Yeah.
Someone who needs to be the center of attention. I mean, all the things we've kind of seen in the primary campaign. I know I'm going to get a lot of nasty mail just by saying anything negative about Donald Trump these days. But speaking as a researcher and as a scholar, he's neither type of a super boss.
Would he, by the way, be an example of a guy that needs to surround himself by sycophants?
Well, it appears to be that way. I didn't interview him,
right.
And I didn't talk to his proteges in the way that I did, all these other people to truly know in any kind of, rigorous way. But, you listen to the things he says and who does he listen to, who does he take counsel from, and he talks about himself more than anyone else. It's not clear that he's looking for a lot of pushback and challenge from people around him.
I want to start with a guy, too, that you found in an unusual place for what's considered a business book, and that's Bill Walsh, because he developed its end-to-end management system of a whole NFL franchise. Talk a little bit about what you uncovered.
Yeah, Bill Walsh, really an interesting example, and a fun one also because there's a lot of data on in the world of sports, which makes it good for people like me to show up and start studying them and trying to figure it out. And what I was interested in, why Walsh got my attention, is I was interested in whether there were any NFL head coaches that had a track record of spawning the best talent, exactly what the super boss phenomenon is all about. And what I did, because of the data that exists, is I looked at all the Super Bowl teams, the head coaches of the winning team and the losing team, so pretty much the two best head coaches each season, and I did a genealogical study of them, meaning not who their parents were, but who they worked for. And I created these trees of talent. And when you do that, as I did, you discover that Bill Walsh is far and away the most influential of any head coach in the history of the NFL. More people came out of his shop, so to speak, than anyone else by far. Bill Parcells, by the way, was number 2, which is kind of interesting. And I think the biggest reason why that's the case is that Parcells had one protege that went on to tremendous success that seems to be in the Super Bowl almost every year, and that's, of course, Bill Belichick from the New England Patriots. So Bill Walsh is a great example of being able to demonstrate what that incredible track record is in terms of giving these opportunities and creating these opportunities for people and spawning these head coaches. And it goes to show you that the super boss pattern and the idea that there are super bosses, it goes across just about any type of industry you can think of.
It's fascinating. And Parcells, who actually plays golf at the same club I do in Saratoga, to me, he's a glorious bastard type of coach, a great coach. The thing about Walsh, too, it's interesting, is NFL is a total copycat league, but he actually invented the West Coast offense with Paul Brown. The other thing, Syd, is that it's interesting. You talk about, I think, that Walsh should be willing to call people to help get them jobs. He, as you know, was very bitter that Paul Brown seemed to block him getting opportunities coming out of the Cleveland.
Yeah, it's a good insight. And what's really in his head and what made him tick, because of course he's passed away. But what made him tick is really interesting. Being passed over for the head coaching job when Paul Brown said something different. I think that had a gigantic influence on his life. and how he thought about it. And one of the things he did say is that's never going to happen to anyone else. Now, that doesn't mean he would just go out of his way to help people if they weren't ready. He would only pick up that phone to talk to an owner, which he would do when there was a head coaching opening, if he thought somebody in his staff was truly ready. And if he didn't, he just wouldn't do it. Now, you have to really think about how unusual that is, because what Bill Walsh did, and it's the most extreme of any of the super bosses when it comes to helping people on their team get other jobs elsewhere, is that he would actually help them get jobs where they would be competing directly against him because they'd be the head coach of another NFL team.
Business Talk with Jim Campbell, syndicated nationally over 350 stations, the Biz Talk Radio Network. Go to biztalkradio.com to find the closest one to you. Listen over the Internet. More Super Bosses with Syd Finkelstein of the Tuck School next. We're back with Professor Syd Finkelstein of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. I just want to finish one thing up on Walsh. Did you find that these super bosses tended to be happier or more satisfied? I know one of the things with Walsh was he's a fairly tormented individual.
These are complicated people, to be sure. I mean, is Larry Ellison happy? Well, I guess if you're a multi-billionaire, it helps you. I think almost without exception that the super bosses appreciated and recognized, some very clearly and others maybe a little bit more subtly, what their impact was on people around them. Even Larry Ellison talked about that. Was Bill Walsh, happy or not? I don't know. Somebody who's this kind of ultra perfectionist, always wants to get better, never can quite reach there, and just expects himself to get there, and you can make yourself crazy also.
All right, let's go through some of the styles and categories within that. The first one I want to start with is sort of the quiet charisma of a guy who was a CEO-making machine, which I hadn't realized. Mike Miles, who comes out of Kraft, the consumer packaged goods marketing, who actually came from my hometown and my parents knew pretty well. And the couple times I met him, he seemed like the epitome of low-key. Charisma didn't stick out.
Wow, that's so interesting. Charisma is not a prerequisite to being a super boss. You do get some of these larger-than-life characters, to be sure. Michael Miles' unbelievable story, because you look at the people that work for him, and they went on to become the CEO of Campbell Soup, of Mattel, of CVS, of Marks and Spencer. I mean, so many different companies. And what was he great at? He really built this kind of apprenticeship model, I would say, within Kraft that made Kraft an absolute machine of developing superstar talent. And by that I mean he would create big opportunities for people. If he thought somebody was able to do something big, he would give them that job, even before maybe that person recognized or thought that they were ready for it. He would roll up his sleeves and dig in. He would get in the weeds with people. He didn't go over that micromanagement line that everybody talks about. Don't be a micromanager. And super bosses, for the most part, are not. But that doesn't mean they just kind of sit back and watch. They roll up their sleeves. They work hand in hand closely with people on their team. And Michael Miles did that as well. Okay,
that leads right into something that it does seem like a paradox, which you term hands-on delegator for these kinds of super bosses. In many cases, I think you cite Ralph Lauren in this case.
Ralph knew everything that was going on in that company. He was extremely detailed, but he also was a big delegator. This is the thing that's there are a lot of counterintuitive things that I found that super bosses do that make it really, really important and really interesting. And this is a big one, which is give people big jobs, but at the same time get in the weeds with them, work with them closely. Most people think about that management style as saying, well, my boss is a big delegator and gives me a lot of rope, versus my boss is a micromanager. But if you start to think about it a little bit differently, as super bosses do, you say, you know what, you could actually delegate big, and why would you want to forget about it? Why wouldn't you want to be a teacher and help them? And you can go far. I mean, Ralph Lauren is someone who, if he didn't like something that somebody was doing, he wouldn't just let it slide. He'd be there because these people, without exception, really are very performance-driven. They've got a vision. They want to accomplish something, and they're not going to take second-best work as acceptable work, and that puts them in the game.
How about an example of a woman super boss for us?
Well, one of my favorites, and I talk about her extensively in the book, is Alice Waters, who's the founder of Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley, and she's the woman that really brought to America farm-to-table, local sourcing, organic, sustainable food, and which you see in every high-end restaurant today. She was the one that really started this in the 70s when she came back from France and opened up a restaurant that had those values. If you look at the people that have gone through her restaurant, there are literally hundreds of people that either were sous chefs or bakers or even waiters and busboys that have opened up their own restaurants, their own companies. And in the case of Alice, I look at her and I say, this is another example of a counterintuitive thing that she did that a bunch of other super bosses did. And I'm referring here to this tremendous vision she had, and I just described it for you, with this farm-to-table view of what food is all about. But at the same time, she would unleash the creativity of the people around her. She wanted to hear your best ideas. She didn't tell you what you needed to do. She gave you a lot of rope, really, to try to figure things out. But she'd also expect you to be, whatever you're doing, to be consistent with her. If you weren't into the idea of what food can be, you wouldn't last with her very long. And so she combined, I call her actually uncompromisingly open. She combined this idea of this uncompromising vision with this openness to new ideas and this unleashing of creativity.
Let's do the entertainment industry for a second here. Two talent machines, Lorne Michaels at Saturday Night Live and Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, and then one that George Lucas was more on the vision plus autonomy, which is how I view Buffett.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, Lucas had a vision of creating a movie or a set of movies that eventually became Star Wars, but he didn't know how to do it. In fact, when he had that idea, there was no technology available, and so he actually became, in a sense, a venture capitalist by funding a dozen different companies. One of which became Industrial Light and Magic, which became a legendary company in that industry. Another one, by the way, became Pixar. So it's pretty interesting. He had that vision, and he had to figure out how to do it, and he gave people that opportunity to do it. In the case of the comedy superstars, Lorne Michaels and Jon Stewart, what they did that I think is so impressive is the way they managed their talent machine and the opportunities that they gave to people. And you look at Lorne Michaels in particular, and you see a really cool thing that he did. There's a cycle of talent that goes through this that goes through SNL from the old days with Belushi, and Gilda Radner, through Tina Fey and Amy Poehler, to more recently Jimmy Fallon, Seth Meyers, and those two are both hosts of the two late-night shows on NBC. The truth of the matter is that Lorne Michaels knew that these people were getting huge opportunities. They were going to leave. What does he do? He helps them get those jobs, kind of a la Bill Walsh from before, right? Helps them get those jobs as the host of the two late-night shows on NBC. And by the way, who's the executive producer of that show? It's Lorne Michaels. And so he's figured out a way to manage the flow of talent, if you will, so that he benefits, plus his protégés benefit at the same time.
All right, we started off saying that it's hard to believe that you could create these guys and have them more prevalent in business and the non-business things. So tell us how you make yourself a super boss.
There are two things I'll say about that. Number one, there are a bunch of first steps you can do, and I'll mention a couple of them, that will get you on the path to becoming a super boss. For example, super bosses will look for talent in unusual places. They look for untapped talent pools. They don't just keep going after the same people. They're always looking for talent, and they'll hire someone and create a job for them on the spot if they think they found someone. So that, just that goes against a lot of traditional HR practice. But you can do it, especially if you're a little bit more senior. What could you do if you're like a lower level or mid-level manager? Well, how about customizing how you work with people on your team? Another hallmark of super bosses. And that means making sure you understand how each person on your team ticks, what motivates them, what energizes them, what opportunities do they need, and get away from this idea that, you have your own leadership style. You are who you are, and everybody has to adapt to you. No other walk of business life is it the case that the whole world has to adapt to you.
I got to say, one of the most insightful leadership gurus, Syd Finkelstein. We had a great time with him, as we always do. Always honored to have him on. Book is Super Bosses, How Exceptional Leaders Master the Flow of Talent. It's published by Portfolio. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Coming next, we'll be talking with President Reagan's son, Michael Reagan. And next up on our leadership show, Lessons My Father Taught Me, Michael Reagan on President Ronald Reagan's legacy of strength, integrity, and faith. Michael Reagan is President Reagan's oldest son. He's chairman of the Reagan Legacy Foundation, also on the board of the John Douglas French Alzheimer's Foundation. And Mike hosted a nationally syndicated, well-known radio talk show for 26 years. And this latest book, Lessons My Father Taught Me, the Strength and Integrity and Faith of Ronald Reagan. Thanks, Mike, for being our second Reagan family member on this show. We had Patty Davis, as I told you a few minutes ago.
Yeah, good deal.
This is a particularly ugly election year that's unfolding, and your dad had uncommon decency. He really marched to the beat of his own drummer, didn't he?
Well, he really did. I mean, or the beat of his mother's drum. I mean, this is a man who never forgot where he came from in Tampico, Illinois. If you ever went to the ranch and visited the ranch house and visited Tampico, Illinois, and where he was raised and went through each house, you wouldn't really see a difference. Just very humble, and that's the kind of person he was. He was a very humble man. And I think that's why he's so well loved. I tell one of the stories in my book about Alec Baldwin, who I ran into coming out of the gym a couple of years ago, and I went up to him and I said, Mr. Baldwin, my name's Mike Reagan. Jane Wyman's my mother. And he kind of looked at me and I said, well, I was afraid to tell you Ronald Reagan was my father for fear I might have to duck. And he kind of chuckled at that, and we talked for a moment. He said, I'm so glad you stopped me. He said, I was having dinner with some friends the other night, told them how much I missed your father. I said, you missed my father. You voted against him every time he had a shot. You sat there and railed against him on every issue known to mankind. What do you mean you missed him? He said, ever since we lost your father, I realized your father had a really good soul. And what the world today is missing is that soul, and I wish we had it back. That's Alec Baldwin.
Well said. And it really was a strategic presidency, looking back on it as well. Is there a fundamental thing that is not known about your dad in your mind?
Yeah, I wrote the book because everybody knows him as a politician. Patty was on the show, and myself, we knew him as Dad. That's what we knew him as. And I think the fundamental thing about my father, he was just decent. He made friends of enemies. He didn't make enemies of friends. He didn't speak down to people. He spoke with people. If you ever spoke to someone, and I'm sure you have, who spoke to my father at an event, shook hands with him, as my dad was at an event, they would tell you that at that very moment, they believed that they were Ronald Reagan's best friend.
It's funny you say that because when I got to know Martin Anderson, the public perception is your dad, he was kind of a lightweight, he was lazy. But Martin told me that the guy intensively was working all the time and thinking and writing. And you get that from your book as well, physically too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was always working. Remember, he grew up in an era when they didn't have television, they didn't have email, they didn't have text, they didn't have all this stuff. They had books. And when you walked in and you looked at his library, he actually read all those books and read them and reread them and read them and reread them. He was so knowledgeable about a number of issues. I talk about this in the book, riding out to the ranch with him on a Saturday. I had 20 years with him, and my sister Maureen had 24, being with him just as Dad going out to the ranch before he got into politics. And he would tell you stories about everything known to mankind. And, he would sing every song of every military group, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard. I mean, this is how he treated us. And you just sit there in awe as you would go out to the ranch and hear these stories time and time again. So knowledgeable on just a host of issues.
Very interesting. I found in your book, too, your family's always been looked at as sort of famously dysfunctional in some ways with the kids. And you talk about that Nancy and Ron, their childhood really informed a lot of how they behaved, and it sort of made it hard for other people, even their kids, to penetrate them. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I do. I've really tried to figure out, why people do things, especially in my own family. And, like I was in boarding school, and I was ticked off and mad when I was in boarding school. As I got older, I started to understand why I was in boarding school, because of the jobs my parents had, if you will. And I look at Dad and Nancy. I mean, Dad, when my mother divorced him, it was just absolutely the worst thing that happened to my father. And my father made like a kind of a promise to himself. I'm never going to let another woman leave me. I'm going to do everything I can to keep a marriage together. On the other hand, you have Nancy, who on the day she's born, her father walks out on her. And she makes a promise to herself, I'm never going to have another man walk out on me. And so now these two people meet, fall madly in love, and get married. One who says, I'm never going to let a man walk out of me. A man who says, I'm never going to lose another woman. And they formed this bond, and it was very tough for anybody to get in between that bond. They were so mad, they were in love with each other. And I don't think they really saw what they were doing to the kids at times, but I think back and I go, like, this is what bonded them, is what happened to them as children. Isn't that what bonds so many of us, the things that we do in the future?
Interesting, too, that an insight that comes out of that. You know, you talk about yourself as being the only real Reagan conservative. Patty and Ron were fairly liberal. But you talk about the fact that they didn't get the 20 years you got, and that they thought that, you know, maybe the conservatives took their parents away.
Well, they did. I mean, the conservatives, the Christian community really took them away. You know, they voted against our father to be president of the United States. And if you really think about it, Ron was 8 years old when Dad ran for governor. Patty was like 14 when he ran for governor. I mean, here's two kids taken out of the house that they're raised in and taken to 300 miles away to Sacramento, put into a home that nobody in the family liked. And they're having to make new friends, new school, new everything. No kid likes to do that. Not at all. And you always affix blame somewhere. And who's to blame? Let's blame politics. And then Dad gets into presidential politics and whatever. And, you know, the light bulb, if you will, the camera isn't just on the dad and the mom. The camera's on the kids, too. And so you put us under an unbelievable amount of pressure. I'll give you an idea. My daughter, Ashley, when she was born in 1983, the Secret Service were in the birthing room. We found out our daughter's code name for the Secret Service before we even found out she was a girl. I mean, nobody understands that side. They always say, oh, this is great, this is wonderful. Well, yeah, but you lose all that privacy that you, in fact, used to have. And I think about Patty and Ron, 8 years old, 13, 14 years old, really losing their father, not able to have those rides out to the ranch as much as Maureen and I had those rides out to the ranch, the riding of horses so much, the shooting the ground squirrels, the chopping of wood, and so on. They did some of it, but not to the extent that I did.
It's a great insight. It's a great insight. I never realized that. Patty talked about what those rides meant to her, and obviously the fact that she got such a lower proportion. Now, obviously the book, you call your dad the greatest man you've known, and we talk about a lot of his values here. Tell first quickly the story. You were adopted, but you felt you were the chosen one with a debt to Maureen.
Yeah, I mean, a debt to Maureen. I mean, Maureen, there at the Schwab's Pharmacy on Sunset Boulevard back in 1944. And Maureen's like 3 years old, 4 years old. She has 97 cents in her little purse, and she puts it on the table in front of the pharmacist. The pharmacist says, "What do you want, little girl?" She says, "I want a brother." And her parents, Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan, are quite embarrassed by all this. And back then, you got to understand that women who were actresses couldn't act if they were pregnant. They didn't put pregnant women on television, in the movies. So there was a lot of us adopted into Hollywood families back in that day. And so what would happen, a young girl would get pregnant in Ohio and come to California and hear about Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman looking for a child, and I would be born in March of 1945. And, when I came home from the hospital, 3 days old, came home to the hospital, my sister Maureen ran upstairs, got her piggy bank out, couldn't get the cork from the bottom of the piggy bank, threw it on the floor, busted the piggy bank, grabbed 97 cents off the floor, ran downstairs and gave it to the nurse and brought me home and said, thank you for my brother. She then found out that I was a younger brother. She thought all boys were older than their sisters. But, you know, that's how I got into the Reagan family. I joke when I go out, I said, I did this at Liberty University last year. I said, I was born German, and 3 days later I was Irish.
Every person's dream, right? The luck of the Irish.
That's right. You want to go out and have beer, I'm the guy to have a beer with.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship station, JR Radio, WGCH. WGCH in Greenwich, Connecticut, and WYBC at Yale. We'll have some more lessons from his father with Michael Reagan coming right up. Our guest, President Reagan's son, Michael Reagan. We're back with some of the lessons that his father taught him. One thing that fascinated me was in the section on speaking the truth and living the truth, it was always considered that, wow, an actor shouldn't be president. How can that be serious? And you talk about acting as revealing ultimate authenticity and truth, which kind of surprised me. We don't think of acting that way often.
You need to remember that people have to draw from what they know. So, and I told one story in the book about Angie Dickinson. My dad did a movie called The Killers. It was terrible. God, it was terrible. And I was at an event with Angie Dickinson a few years ago, and we were talking about The Killers. She said, you know your dad was terrible in that movie. I said, well, the whole movie was terrible, and I know Dad wasn't that good either. She says, you know why your dad wasn't good in that movie? I said, no, why? He's never been a bad guy.
Yeah.
He didn't know how to relate. They put him in a position of being a bad guy in a movie, and your father's never been a bad guy. My dad truly understood, the camera's going to pick up your flaws. It's going to pick up everything. And you better be camera ready when you show up and really know what, in fact, you're talking about and know what you believe and know why you believe it. And he really did.
The movies, Hollywood, and politics, would seem to attract the most narcissistic, self-centered people you can find. Where did he get such humility in those two professions, particularly when we see folks like Donald Trump running for president now?
From his mother, from his father, from the people he grew up with in Tampico, Dixon, Illinois. He was in awe of where he went, but he also understood who he was, and that's why he used his humor. He could use his humor to kind of deflate things or make people feel at ease, if you will, in front of him because they'd be nervous in front of him because where he had risen to. But he was so very, very humble in all facets of his life. I mean, one of the placards he had on his desk was, "No telling where a man can go or what he can accomplish. He doesn't worry who gets the credit."
Where did he get that visionary sense of almost a dreamer and, saw reshaping and restructuring the relationship with the Soviet Union when détente was the way, saw the SDI not as more than a negotiating tactic? Is it come from being the child of an alcoholic? And where did he get the courage of these convictions?
God, he loved his father so much. His father, he thought being an alcoholic still taught him a lot. What his father said to him one time, when they start paying you not to work, why work? And Dad would pass that down to me and what have you. I remember in 1976, and I talked about it in my book, saying to my dad, why do you want to run for president? This is when he lost. And he said, Michael, for so long I've watched American presidents sit down with Secretary General of the Soviet Union. Every time we sit down with them, they ask us to give up something to get along with them. I wanted to run for presidency and win so I could sit down with the Secretary General of the Soviet Union. And when he was telling me what it was I was going to have to give up to get along with him, I was going to get up from the table, walk around the other side of it, lean over and whisper in his ear, "Yet." I was going to say no to the Secretary General. Let's think about this for a moment. This is 76. He doesn't know he's going to run yet. So I tell people, Nancy hadn't told him he was going to run in 1980 yet. So here we go. And in 1980, he does run. He wins. In 1986, 10 years later, almost to the date, in October of 86, he's in Reykjavik, Iceland. Mikhail Gorbachev says to him, "Hey, if you want me to sign on the START agreement, you're going to have to give up SDI or Star Wars." Ronald Reagan does what? He says, "Yet." No, and he walks away. And everybody in the media thought it was the worst thing that ever happened to Ronald Reagan, that he absolutely got crushed by Mikhail Gorbachev in that. But 2 years later, the Berlin Wall falls.
Do you find it almost breathtaking that he had the guts and would not be necessarily considered a pure conservative vision to go for a nuclear-free world?
No, I'm not surprised at all. Remember, he was fighting communism. He was all that. This was not a new battle for him. This was something he was just so knowledgeable in and so learned in all of his entire life. And he was a peaceful guy. But You get into politics and people think other things. And this is why I wrote the book. I didn't want you to see the political side of Ronald Reagan. I wanted you to see the dad side.
Yeah.
The side that I saw for 20 years before he got into politics. I mean, the worst thing that happened to you in politics, you wake up one morning and somebody says, hey, you won. The worst thing that happens to you in politics, hey, you won. Because politics, takes you away from family. It doesn't bring you to family. And if you're Ron and Patty, and all of a sudden your father's no longer at home, you're no longer taking the rides to the ranch, you're not able to spend the time with him because other people are taking the time that used to be yours, I can understand their anger and frustration at the conservative movement, at the Christian community, because they were the ones in their minds that took their father away from them.
Was it difficult living up to such a legendary guy? And talk a little bit about what you're doing for the Reagan Legacy Foundation and the John Douglas French.
When you really think about it, there's only two people who were ever born or raised in a family with an Academy Award-winning actress and the guy who's going to be President of the United States. That's my sister Maureen and I. Wow. Nobody else has lived that life. A lot of times, no matter what you do, it's so overshadowed by who you are. A lot of people don't know I've written 8 books, and a lot of people don't know I was Alpha World Champion in 67.
I didn't know that either.
Of the year, 5 world records during the 1980s, #1 fundraiser for the United States Olympic team back to the 1984 Olympics. 26 years, he said in talk radio. Nobody knows what you did because you're so overshadowed by who you are. And it can make you very angry and very frustrated. Like, what do I need to do to somebody say, hello, how are you? And that's tough. I think where I changed up is I finally just said, accepted it. And said, this is who I am. There's nothing I do about it. My God, be proud that Ronald Reagan was your father and the things he was able to accomplish. I travel all over the world. And I'm as close to Ronald Reagan as anybody's ever going to get. And so they come up to me and tell me all the stories. We formed the Reagan Legacy Foundation to supply scholarships for the men and women who serve on the USS Ronald Reagan. I was just there in March 15th passing out $25,000 scholarships to the kids on the ship. We just opened up last week, dedicated the Ronald Reagan Center at St. Mary Glees, Normandy, France. First town freed by America on D-Day. We produced a 55-minute film for that opening that will shortly be on the military channel. We did things in Berlin. We have a Ronald Reagan Center at the Celli Museum. If people are going to say, hey, you're Ronald Reagan's kid, what else do you do? So I'll just be Ronald Reagan's kid, and what else do I do? Is honor my father wherever he was in the world. And that's what we do. People can go to ReaganLegacyFoundation.org. We have a brick program we've now started. You can buy a brick to honor a World War II vet from the European theater and be put at St. Mary Glees, the first town freed by America on D-Day. You'll get a like brick, a paver of your own that matches the one we're going to put at St. Mary Glees. So they can go there, ReaganLegacyFoundation.org. I work for John Douglas French Alzheimer's Foundation. I now chair it. 100% of the money that we raise goes to find a cure.
We do miss President Reagan, and I can't think of any greater honor than that you've dedicating your life at this stage to honor the Reagan legacy. It's ReaganLegacyFoundation.org. It's Michael Reagan we've been talking about, oldest child of President Reagan, and the book is Lessons My Father Taught Me, the Strength, Integrity, and the Faith of Ronald Reagan. It's a great read. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You can get podcasts at iTunes. Search Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Our next show is going to be a big deal. We got a rare interview with one of the most powerful women on Wall Street at the time, the chief financial officer of Lehman Brothers when the firm collapsed in the financial crisis of '08. That's Erin Callan. I want to thank Professor Syd Finkelstein from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, Michael Reagan, and thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is segment 5, our overtime segment exclusively for Yale Radio. A special bonus, the largely forgotten but Kennedy family favorite daughter, the charmed life and tragic death of Kit Kennedy. Barbara Leaming is making her second appearance on our show. We loved having her last time. She talked about her groundbreaking insights that she uncovered in her book, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. She's got 2 other best-selling books, Churchill Defiant and Jack Kennedy, The Education of a Statesman. Her latest effort, Kit Kennedy, The Charmed Life and Tragic Death of the Favorite Kennedy Daughter. Welcome back, Barbara.
Hi, Jim. It's wonderful to be back.
And you know, two of my favorite things are Kennedy and Britain, my dad coming from there, as we talked about. So this is right in my wheel spot, our wheel spot. I'm going to start, though, with People magazine. I read the story about the book in there, and I think there's just a great analogy you use, that Kick Kennedy was the psychological twin of JFK. Tell us what you mean.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite lines, too. It's not my own. Somebody told me that very early on when I was doing a biography of President Kennedy, and they said, in the family, the two people who you should watch are the psychological twins. And by that they meant Jack and Kick. And what they were talking about is how much alike the two of them really were. I mean, like Jack, Kick, I guess we should first of all just tell people that one of the reasons that they don't know who Kick is that she was not just Jack Kennedy's favorite sister, but she was somebody who died in a plane crash when she was only 28. So there's a reason why history has forgotten her. But like Jack, she was somebody who was wildly ambitious, and she was someone who wanted power and wanted to be a person of influence. But she's born into this family where Joe Kennedy has told all of his kids that they're not supposed to think of themselves so much as individuals. They're supposed to think of themselves as a unit, as Kennedys. And for Jack's ego, that wasn't so much a problem, because the way that he solved the ego issue was by fighting his way to the top. He wanted to be the top Kennedy. He wanted to oust the older brother, Joe Jr., who was his father's favorite as they were growing up and was the one that his father said should be president. And Jack did, in fact, end up ousting Joe from the top position before Joe was killed. But for a girl in the Kennedy family, you were never going to make it to the top, even if you were the favorite and the most beloved and everything else. And so Kick found herself in this situation that she's full of all the same drives that her brother has, but where does she go with that? And what happened, and that's why this is such a strange story, is that at the age of 18, when her father was made a U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James in London, Kick went with her father, as did the other children, and she suddenly saw something that was as overwhelming as the family unit that she was stuck in, and that is, of all things, the British aristocracy. And so what happened here is we end up with a story that is absolutely not the typical Kennedy story. Instead, Kick's story takes us into a whole other world, into the world of the British aristocracy, but not just into that world at any moment in time, but at a moment when the world of their power is turning upside down. It's the last chapter of the British aristocracy. And the reason that I wrote the book is because it is an enormously important moment in history, and unexpectedly the Boston saloon keeper's granddaughter takes you into this world and to its very, very center. So it's an extraordinarily strange story, but an unexpected one, and nothing has ever been more fun to write than this was.
And in fact, it's very fascinating as history, too, because you feel you're deep inside. I'm going to put this all together. She seemed just plain different from the other Kennedy sisters, and you also describe her as quite plain, although with that striking energy and charisma. I want you to talk about that, and also within how she charmed British society, which was so class-conscious and anti-Catholic.
Yeah, that was the big mystery for me, because when I started doing this, actually in 2002, this is a very long project, and it's been through two other books while I was doing both Jack Kennedy and Winston Churchill, and I was immersed in this world of where the cousins marry each other, and where you don't get inside that world. It's a very strange, strangely closed world, and here's this. I mean, no one can really describe her as beautiful except if you've been in the room with her. And then what all of the boys who I talked to who had been in love with her at one point or thought they were in love with her would all say, oh, no, the minute that she started talking, the minute that she started moving, you thought she was beautiful. But what was interesting to me was, and I was talking, I mean, one of the reasons I was able to write this book was that I walked in at a very strange moment. The people who had been closest to Kick, including the people the woman who inherited Kick's life, because when Kick was killed at the age of 28, something very strange happened. The Duchess of Devonshire, Debo Devonshire, who some of your listeners probably know as the last of the Mitford sisters, and Debo was one of the main sources for this book for a very specific reason, because when Kick went to England, she ended up married to a young boy called Billy Hartington, who was the Marquis of Hartington, and who was supposed to be one day the Duke of Devonshire, which is one of the two most powerful Protestant families in England and in English history. And she was going to have this incredible life. Jack was going to be president. She was going to be a duchess. And when she finally married Billy, after 6 years, he was killed in the war only 4 months later. And as a result, his brother inherited the dukedom and eventually became the Duke, and he was married to Debo Devonshire, and she became the Duchess. And in effect, Debo lived Kick's life. And when I was talking to Debo, I was lucky enough to get into this world at a moment when these people were still not only alive and able to talk at great length, but wanted to, because what I realized very, very early on was that Kick meant something big to them, not just her personal story and not just the way that it intertwined with their personal story, but because they had come to see her as a kind of emblem of everything that had been lost by them personally, but also by the aristocracy at that moment. And so for 50 years after Kick's death, they'd been talking among themselves about this. And what was extraordinary for me as a historian going into this was I was talking to really highly intelligent people who were ready to be absolutely honest and candid about what their thinking was about the period, about what they had done, about whether or not they were willing to fight, what the war had cost them. Because this is very much a book about war and what war costs the society, the transformations it affects in a society, but also the way that it affects people personally. And I think that one of the things that was also important is I was told this very early on when I started working in England and at great length, and that is that when you're talking particularly to the aristocracy, they see themselves as the trustees of history, and they feel that it's their duty to pass it on. And so instead of having to fight to get information, I found people pulling out their diaries from the period, going through. I mean, one of the people who I was talking to at great length was Lady Lloyd, Jean Lloyd, whose father had been the Lord Chamberlain to the Queen, and who had been Kick's guide to this world, because it's a very rarefied, weird world for an 18-year-old American girl to walk into. And Jean had been assigned to tell her how things work. And strangely enough, 50 years later, Jean sat with me and went through everything step by step and said, this is how it works. So I had a feeling, a kind of visceral sense of what the experience had been like for her. The whole period was so important, obviously, for everybody, because it culminates in 1945 when Winston Churchill is thrown out of office, and suddenly British society is turned upside down at the end of the war. And it's very, I don't think I could have written the book had I not done the Churchill book in between. That was very important because the politics of it are extremely, extremely important to understand and complicated.
To me, this is kind of sad, but she was the protector of Rose Kennedy. We're talking Kick now. Unlike Joe Jr. and JFK, who kind of repudiated her or mocked her or felt she was too rigid. We're talking Rose now. And yet, when Kick does this and gets hooked up with the Devonshire family, not only does does Rose repudiate it, but rather than focus pure on the religious issues, she says it's a blow to family prestige.
Yeah, the relationship between Kick and her mother it's a very, very sad one. And what was saddest about it was that I think for Kick, she was able ultimately to, when she married Billy Hartington, she felt that she had reconciled her religious problems, because for her, I think the Catholicism was displaced into the code of duty and honor that Billy lived for. And I think for Kik that made it somehow okay. But what wasn't okay was her relationship with her mother, because Kik was the one. I remember somebody telling me about being at Hyannisport when Kik, before she went to England, when she was a young teenager. Joe Kennedy brought one of his mistresses to the lunch table with Rose sitting there and the kids. And it wasn't Jack or Joe who said, Dad, this is wrong. It was Kik who stood up and said, Daddy, this doesn't go. You can't do this in front of Mommy. And she had always been her mother's protector. And yet you can see in at the time of her marriage to Billy, she's going to have to hurt her mother, and that's devastating for her. And it was never really repaired. And what made it even worse was that after Billy Hartington died, and Billy's a fascinating character. I mean, there's, again, where you see how war changes someone. He's an astonishingly interesting and much more complex character than Kik understood, too, I think. But after Billy was killed, Kik fell in love with a married British aristocrat and a Protestant. And, of course, that made things even worse with her mother. But I think not just with her mother, who said, you know, if you marry Peter Fitzwilliam, which was the man's name, if you marry him, you're never going to speak to any Kennedy again. But worse than that, I think, for Kik, and I think that's something you have to remember. And this is, again, as we were saying earlier, this is a very young girl. She found herself having to do something that she couldn't live with comfortably herself, having been the one who stood up and said, Daddy, this is wrong what you're doing to Mommy. Now she found herself in the position of the mistress going to visit the wife, and that was not, Kik is not a bad person by any stretch of the imagination. And as Billy's sister, who adored Kik, said to me at the end of the story, she said, I don't know how Kik was going to be able to live with this. This was too much for her, this final romance. It was it was something that she was never going to be able to work out. And she also had tremendous illusions about Peter Fitzwilliam. I mean, Peter Fitzwilliam was much richer than anybody and was living a life that nobody was living after the war, but he was a very dissipated man, and he was very much a womanizer and a drinker, and it wasn't going good places. Kik thought she idealized him for reasons that are complicated politically, but she was in a very, very dangerous position at the moment when she died, and and certainly her relationship with her family, because they didn't bury her. I mean, when she was killed in the plane crash, it was Billy's mother who came in and said, you're leaving the body lying in Paris. Someone has to bury her. If you allow us to, we will take her back to Chatsworth, the palace of the Devonshire Dukes, and we will bury her in our little country churchyard as Billy's wife, which is what, and we love her, and we want to do it. Not only do we love her this much, but even though we are the most anti-Catholic of families, we will bury her as a Catholic in exactly the way that would be right for her and for her mother and everything else. But her mother didn't come to the funeral. Only old Joe was standing there at the grave. And as Debo Devonshire said to me, Joe was standing there in this crumbled old navy blue suit that he'd obviously been in for days since he'd identified the body, and she said he was as crumbled and destroyed as the suit. It's a tragic image at the end.
It gives me goosebumps thinking of a mother basically allowing another family to bury their child in a foreign country. You leading into Joe Kennedy now is great, because that's my next question. Joe Kennedy Jr. died 1 month after this crash. And so within the space of a month, he loses Hope, which is Joe Jr., and her favorite, Kik. How did this end up affecting him?
No, actually, Joe had died. Joe died just before Kik's first husband.
Oh, sorry, I did have that note. I read it in reverse. 1 month, yeah, got it.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right. The two losses, the loss of Joe Kennedy's favorite son, and also, Jack Kennedy, I think was terribly, terribly destroyed by. He was a war hero, and he came back alive, but he was not in good health, and it took a terrible psychological toll on him. So he's seeing his younger son barely able to walk, and then he loses his favorite daughter. And I think at that point for Joe Kennedy, it was simply, too much for him to handle. I think it did destroy him, and destroyed a part of him that was able to deal with reality. And after that, a lot of fantasy kicked in for Joe. I think a lot of things he couldn't bear to remember, and I think that the image of him standing there at the grave, except that there's still something in him that wants to go on. But it's Joe Kennedy. I think the other thing that was very hard for him is when he arrived in England, he was beloved because he was on the side of a lot of people in the world that he was operating on. He thought any agreement with Hitler was worthwhile in order to avoid war. The danger for him was coming from Russia. And then when he found himself on the wrong side in England and became one of the most hated men in England, that was also devastating for his ego. I mean, he came out of the war, a war that he had fought to avoid, with tremendous cost. And again, this is one of the reasons for this story is that it's you see the tremendous personal toll that it takes on people, no matter what your position is with war. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating to me about the boys in this story is, as Andrew Devonshire said to me, they expected to die. These are boys who are drinking too much and crashing their cars and everything else, but they think the minute the war starts, we're going to die. And they're spending their days with girls who are thinking about parties and have no idea of what's coming and what's going to hit them. And then suddenly, overnight, the reality is there. And it changes everything forever for all of them. It's in a way a very great war story. I mean, it's a horror of war story.
And thanks again to Barbara Leaming for staying with us on Overtime. Our next show, a big deal, a rare interview with one of the most powerful women on Wall Street at the time, the chief financial officer of Lehman Brothers, when the firm collapsed back in the financial crisis of 2008. That's Erin Callan. And once again, thanks to Syd Finkelstein on his book on super bosses, Michael Reagan on President Reagan, and Barbara Leaming on Kick Kennedy. Thanks to our loyal Yale audience for staying with us. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.